Hello and welcome. Mark Wilson here from the Caroline Marshall Drawn Center for the Arts and Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts at Auburn University, coming to you live from Pebble Hill, the historic Scott Yarborough House in Auburn. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Bertis English from Alabama State University to discuss his new book, Civil Wars, Civil Beings, and Civil Rights in Alabama's Black Belt, A History of Perry County. A little bit about Dr. English. He's originally from Talladega, Alabama. He's a graduate of Talladega College, of Jacksonville State University, and earned a Ph.D. from Auburn University. He has been teaching at Alabama State University since 2002. He is completing a term as editor of the International Journal of Africana Studies, and we congratulate Dr. English on this publication and welcome Dr. English to our program today. Thanks, Bertis, for joining us.
Thanks, Mark, my former GTA mate and Maven and others at the Drawn Center for the Arts. Of course, that's a special place in my heart for reasons I've yet to say. So before I commence my short presentation, I promise it'll be shorter than Mark's introduction and much briefer than the book for those of you who are familiar with it. It's a few pages. Let me thank those at the University of Alabama Press for putting up with me essentially to make sure that this publication saw the light of day, so to speak. I particularly want to thank former acquisitions editor Donna Baker, who was with me from the outset of this particular project. Editor-in-chief Dan Waterman, likewise, was always kind and professional. The referees that the press also secured to assess the merits and demerits of the book were extremely helpful, as was managing editor John Berry. So I would like to again move back to the Drawn Center for the Arts, because the individual who was responsible in large part for the dissertation that is now the book, my first real conversation with him took place at the Center for the Arts. It was late 1990s. I had not yet been admitted to the program, the doctoral program in history at Auburn, but the individual who oversaw my master's thesis, Harvey Jackson III at Jacksonville State, had contacted this individual. And of course, the person is Janeway Flint. And so in speaking with him, he didn't tell me this now when I first met him in the late 1990s. He and Dr. Jackson will only tell me this later. But evidently, in quote, recommending me for the program in Auburn, Dr. Jackson told Dr. Flint that Bertis might be the best student you ever had or the worst. So I'm definitely not the best student that Dr. Flint ever had. It's my hope that I was not the worst, but even if I was, that's okay, because simply counting my name among his students is rewarding for me. So again, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Flint, and others, I appreciate your mentoring me and your continuing to mentor me as I progress through my career at Alabama State University. And your friendship means even more to me than that. So if I might, rather than launching directly into Civil War, Civil Beings, and Civil Rights, and of course I will discuss a bit of the rationale for the title, but I would rather move backward. That is, rather than commencing with Perry County at its outset during the early 19th century, I would like to take a second, well, a little bit more than a second, a few minutes, frankly, in looking at Perry County right now. So according to federal data, in the year 2016, the county population of Perry was about 10,000 individuals. Of that total, 69% was Black, 30% was white, 1% was, quote, Latino, unquote. Marion, the county seat, had 3,500 residents and was the most populous town in the county, followed by Uniontown at the southern end of the county. The median household income in Perry in 2016 was about $24,000 compared with almost $45,000 for the state as a whole. Per capita income for Perry was $14,000 and nearly $25,000 for Alabama. In Perry County and the Alabama Black Belt in general, agriculture, cotton, corn, lumber, sweet potatoes was the primary occupation from the county's first Reconstruction of the 1860s and the 1870s, and I'll chat a little bit, of course, more about that, through the country's so-called second Reconstruction of the 1950s and the 1960s. And of course, persons are using that language to refer to the modern civil rights movement or the freedom struggle. During the Jim and Jane Crow years of the late 19th century into the early 20th century, some citizens added livestock to the local economy of Perry. By the middle 20th century, neighboring counties such as Tuscaloosa and farther away Montgomery were joining the industrial movement that Calhoun and Etowah and Jefferson, among other places in the so-called mineral belt, led toward the end of the 19th century. Data regarding the exact numbers of Perry inhabitants who relocated to Jefferson or to Montgomery or to Tuscaloosa and more industrialized counties from the late 1800s through the middle 1900s are incomplete. But the individuals who remained in Perry County during that time span continued primarily to engage in agriculture, eventually making some headway financially and economically through catfish farming by the late 1900s, but primarily agriculture was the main staple. But even with that enterprise, catfish farming, which expanded during the early 21st century, the typical Perry resident today is a rural county person or a townsperson seeking employment outside agriculture, such as in the automobile plants of Jefferson and Tuscaloosa counties. Without reliable transportation, however, one cannot drive free of worry to Jefferson or to Tuscaloosa or to any place else outside Perry. What's worse, according to U.S. News and World Report, almost 14% of households in Perry do not have a single automobile. Statewide, that percentage is 7%. The internet and other digital technologies could provide ways for the residents of Perry County to take advantage of employment opportunities away from Perry County, but only 2 of 10 households in Perry have internet access. Nationwide, 9 of 10 households possess it. The state legislature passed a Broadband Act in 2018 to bolster access, particularly in underserved areas. But according to a recent study by the University of Alabama, not a single household in Perry has internet coverage of 100 megabits per second of broadband, which is the average statewide. The FCC considers a locality served if its residents average 25, and nearly 90% of Alabama's residents meet that mark. In short, those in Perry and in neighboring Black Belt counties are woefully underserved. A 2019 piece of state legislation permits local electric cooperatives or co-ops to use infrastructures for new fiber optic lines to expand broadband access. The state government also earmarked roughly $275 million in federal CARES Act money to increase broadband access for kindergarten through high school students who are learning virtually. But it's difficult to learn virtually without adequate internet access, even though increased learning opportunities of every type are needed badly in Perry County. Despite high rates of high school graduations, approximately 90%, only 19% of residents have an advanced degree. Nationwide, 39% is the mean. Other state and federal collaborations, such as initiatives led by the U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Utility Service, might provide additional fiber optics lines in the coming years and hence increase accessibility to an assortment of digital educational opportunities. But with technology advancing rapidly, many observers are concerned that the needs of Perry County will outpace reforms in Perry County. With a household income roughly $24,000, Perry County not only has a high percentage of residents, approximately 45%, who are impoverished by traditional government metrics, but also has a high percentage, almost 99%, of students who receive free or reduced price meals and related state or federal assistance. But without multiple grocery stores that sell healthy foodstuffs at affordable prices within the county, the overall healthiness of its population is extremely lower than much of Alabama, and even lower when compared with the average state of health countrywide. For instance, the prevalence of obesity in Perry is about 46%. The national median for obesity is about 28%. The same rates for diabetes and other sorts of illnesses. Diabetes, for example, being 18% in Perry County, 9% nationwide. COVID-19 has both exacerbated and highlighted bad conditions in Perry County. Large numbers of Alabamans rely on the internet to receive information about the pandemic or to have video conferences, telehealth conferences, essentially with healthcare professionals. But those endeavors often require quality and reliable internet service, which most citizens of Perry do not have, despite the 2018 legislation. Data for safe drinking water, sewage, and infant mortality are comparably grim. In terms of quality of life, today, Perry County ranks among the bottom counties in the state. And the Uniontown placement of one of the largest waste facilities in Alabama doubtless will not help Perry raise better its quality of life position. That Perry County does not have a single hospital worsens matters. Perry has a health department, and it has 2 nursing homes, insufficient private and public health insurance. About 11% of residents in Perry have no insurance, and almost 90% rely on Medicare, or, as stated earlier, unreliable transportation causes a number of Perry's residents to go without emergency and comfortable treatment, so they stay in their homes when they're sick. One public health employee in Perry estimates that more than half of the county receives some type of disability payment, and subsequently asked in a recent telephone conversation, if you're going to put $1 million industry in a town, would you put it in a place where most of the population cannot work for you? Perry had a foundry, the same employee made clear, but it closed when union leaders advocated for better working conditions, wages, and related just causes. This employee could have made a legitimate statement about state advocacy for Perry County. Lawmakers and other decision makers in Montgomery County do not provide much help, monetarily or otherwise, nor do these individuals seek to form major partnerships with private business people in Perry. Without such aid, the majority of citizens in the predominantly Black county must rely on a few college or university partnerships, or alternatively, fend for themselves, though some local government officials, together with members of ministerial and with other primarily volunteer organizations, for example, the Sowing Seeds of Hope, Uniontown Cares, do provide as much help as they can lend, though they tend to have limited financial resources. The University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa has 57 Miles Initiative, the Black Belt Experience, Books for the Black Belt, and other programs that operates with the county government of Perry to improve academic education, standardized test preparation, tutorials in STEM fields, economic development, and healthcare. Alabama State University, where I am, has multiple partnerships with Perry County, and as recently as April, 2 graduates started a campaign to erect COVID-19 testing stations in Perry, but major problems remain in the county. Historian and journalist David Halberstam, writing in 1998 about Perry County and its conditions during the 1960s, where my book essentially stops, declared that the typical family in Perry lived in a shack without running water and without electricity. Inside the home, there was a sad little table and a few chairs. Outside, open sewage ran in a stream in the backyard. This was a home of people who were so poor that they barely showed up on the national census statistics. This statement remains as applicable to Perry County today as it was in 1998 or during the 1960s. So civil wars, civil beings, and civil rights essentially moves through those types of activities. Now, I do not bring the story to the early 21st century, save for Alabama State University, which is the most notable successor to the original Lincoln School, about which I'll speak in a second. But that story that I just relayed or attempted to summarize does provide a continuum of the major issues that confront Perry County today, and the major cause, in my opinion, of that issue. And that's, as W.E.B. Du Bois would state in 1903, the color line. So when one takes a look at Perry County at the outset of the 19th century, when Alabama gained statehood, one sees that Perry County, for a number of reasons, rose to be an extremely productive locality. In part was the geography. Perry County is located in the Black Belt, that 4,600 square miles of predominantly lush land that spans from Mississippi, well, actually outside of Mississippi to Texas, all the way through the eastern border of Alabama. Called Black because of its very rich, again, terrain, and ultimately, though some individuals still debate this process, because of those dark-skinned individuals, Black and by ethnic enslaved persons who would be so numerous in Perry and other Black Belt counties. Right through the American Civil War, Perry County was a major player, not only in sort of the finance and economic condition of Alabama and the South, but also the entire country. As late as 1860 rather, for example, Alabama was producing about 20% of the world's cotton production, and Perry County was responsible for almost 47,000 of those bales of cotton. A few decades earlier, when the United States of America was undergoing an economic recession in the 1830s, Perry County and surrounding places were actually thriving during that time, in part because of the rich soil that was located in the area, as well as some innovations, of course, in technology. Cotton gins, for example, were becoming better, but also because the land located in the Black Belt was priced relatively inexpensively. So individuals from Georgia and from Tennessee and from Virginia and other parts of the country and the world, though to a much lesser extent, moved to Perry County en masse to take advantage of the inexpensive land, but also to utilize those enslaved individuals and partially enslaved individuals to produce that white gold, cotton. So with that financial and economic foundation firmly intact, from the 1830s to 1860, and of course in the 1861, Perry County would have a number of extremely important policymakers and decision makers. Perhaps the most known is Andrew B. Moore Sr., who would be Alabama's governor from 1857 until 1861, the person who sort of oversaw the entrance of Alabama into the Confederate States, the newer American nation. But Moore was not the only individual who was important, and I'm not going to give a whole list of individuals. I'll mention two, and then we'll move on from that. But yet another individual was essentially responsible largely for kind of directing the movement of the Constitutional Convention that decided to secede. And that was William Brooks, who was president of that secession convention, an extremely well-respected attorney. And he and the vast majority of his other attorneys decided to secede from the Union, in large part because of the very thing that helped Perry County to become so financially secure and politically secure during the antebellum period. And that was slavery. So that's essentially where the first chapter of the book takes up. That is War and Secession. And I make clear that despite some existing beliefs, both inside and more commonly perhaps outside of academia, regarding Alabamians and other Southern lawmakers who decided to secede and form the Confederacy, doing so for reasons other than race-based slavery, that race-based slavery was indeed the rock upon which the Confederacy was built, as one person said. So the book then kind of moves through what was happening in Perry County during the wartime years. And, unlike, say, northern Alabama and part of the Piedmont area, the Black Belt escaped much of the physical damage that was caused by the Union and the Confederate forces, because the Union forces did not make it into Perry County and other parts of the Black Belt until late in the conflict. Perry County, again, it went largely unscathed. Now, Dallas County, of course, with Selma being such a very important site militarily, did not do as well as Perry County, but Perry was able to come out of the war relatively well, although some of the relatively well physically. Okay, and again, this is what I attempt to make clear in the book. The psychological and the emotional and the mental issues or after effects of that war, of course, would be substantial to all, but no more, I think, than the Black population that was in Perry County. And I'm not going to read many quotations from the book and so forth. It is my hope that you will. That's a self-pub there. I probably shouldn't, but I am. But here is what Lewis E. Parsons, the provisional governor of Alabama, said during the 1865 Constitutional Convention. And this is essentially the second chapter of the book. It looks at political organization, sort of the economic reorganization and racial violence in the aftermath of the war. He said, "There is no longer a slave in Alabama. It is thus made manifest to the world that the right of secession for the purpose of establishing a separate confederacy based on the idea of African slavery has been fully and effectually tried and is a failure." Lewis, again, non-native Southerner, native Southerner in the Dallas-Selma Times around the same time. "We cannot agree to admit the Negro to social or political equality with us. We must now and forever hereafter ignore equality with the Negro." Of course, that idea was not uncommon following the American Civil War, but I submit that Perry County was, if not an anomaly, certainly not the normal locality in the Black Belt. Whereas individuals oftentimes referred to Reconstruction, post-war Reconstruction, derogatorily as a dreadful decade, among other derogatory terms, Perry County was a place that did not see as much recorded physical violence and verbal harassment and so forth as did other Black Belt localities. It is my belief, again, that Perry County was a place where there was much civility. There were many civil beings, hence that part of the title. Now, I would be outright incorrect if I were to suggest that Perry County was a utopia during that time. It was not. But Perry County was a place where a marked degree of bi-ethnic sort of uplift occurred. And in the third chapter, I provide what I view to be some of the reasons for that. But as I think a very important example of the type of bi-ethnic work that the citizens of Perry County were able to construct was the Lincoln School that I referenced briefly at the outset of my discussion. So 1867, essentially there is, and the development of the Lincoln School, I kind of give this away, would ultimately be Alabama State University, not in Marion, of course. In Montgomery, something else I can discuss if persons are interested in that particular story. But Lincoln School in Perry County at Marion, named after, of course, the deceased president, Abraham Lincoln, and started originally by a Union War veteran who was a Congregationalist minister, but who also was an agent for the American Missionary Association. And here is where in my opinion, the quasi, if not entire uniqueness of Perry County comes into play. Whereas it might not have been exceptional for a group of Black and bi-ethnic individuals to attempt to construct these educational learning centers, essentially with the meager means that they had, the American Missionary Association, along with the Freedmen's Bureau and a group of intrepid Black and bi-ethnic citizens in Perry County, developed the school from a private missionary institution located in an old Methodist church in 1867 to in 1870, a publicly sponsored normal school or teachers academy for individuals of African descent, and not simply male persons of African descent, but male and female, which was unknown in the American South at the time. In fact, the Lincoln Normal School was the first institution of its type that is supported by public dollars, by taxpayer dollars, to offer that type of training, a normal school education to persons of African ancestry in a co-educational manner that is serving both men and women. So that's one of the major stories of chapter 2. The third chapter, I sort of reverse order and move back to some of the reasons why. The book is largely chronological, moving from the antebellum period up through the middle 20th century. But in the third chapter, I do take more of a thematic approach, and that is discussing some of the cultural and also the political sort of foundations of Perry County that made it such an important center, both before the American Civil War and then following the American Civil War. So I concentrate largely on, with regard to religiosity, Baptists. Baptists sort of led the way, as several individuals, Dr. Flint, for example, and others have made clear that Perry County, and Marion in particular, was the Baptist capital of not only Alabama, but some have, I think, convincingly argued, of the South. Some of the first Baptists, predominantly Black, but predominantly white, that is a large population of Black congregants and bi-ethnic congregants, but the leadership was white, were located in Marion, Salem, for example, Okmulgee, for example. And those congregations, the parishioners there began to worship, open, that is, worship to Black as well as white persons at the outset of the founding of those churches. Things would change, of course, as the 1830s and the 1840s rolled around, particularly with regard to slavery, when Baptists sort of seceded from the national church because some of the Baptist leaders who were pro-slavers wanted slave holders and those who served as masters and so forth to serve in very prominent positions. Be that as it may, some of those relationships that were grown by white persons and non-white persons in those Baptist churches of Marion sort of survived that fissure. With Marion being the Baptist capital of Alabama here solely, and with so many individuals coming to visit that particular place, those Baptist leaders and non-Baptist leaders, Methodists and Presbyterians and others, would give a little bit more latitude to the domestics and to the other workers in Marion and other parts of Perry County than did many persons in neighboring places. For example, there was one particular pastor at a church in Marion, at Solomon in Marion, who allowed a bi-ethnic leather worker and a blacksmith and shoemaker by the names of James M. Child or Childs to actually sermonize, to preach to individuals in the basement of the church. That type of almost autonomous worship was virtually unheard of in Alabama and the South at the time. Later, of course, Alabama lawmakers would introduce and pass legislation that made it illegal for individuals to do that type, individuals of African ancestry to do that type of fellowshipping without being monitored by several white men. So again, that's just an example of the type of bi-ethnic sort of mutual agency and uplift that I think sort of set the stage for Perry County's anomalous character moving into Reconstruction. So the largest parts of the book, chapters 4 through 7, discuss Reconstruction. Well, really discusses the reconstructions of Alabama, because some persons forget that Alabama was redeemed or restored, so to speak, from Republican rule not one time in 1874, but actually restored or redeemed from predominant Republican rule on the state level twice in 1870 and again in 1874. So the focus of those particular chapters is not simply the traditional white leadership who, without question, was responsible for making the majority decisions. In addition to those individuals, on whom one cannot concentrate, I think, if one wants to have a balanced presentation of Alabama Reconstruction, but also on the Black and the bi-ethnic lawmakers. Again, Perry County was a feature is a feature in this story because of the relatively large number of Black and bi-ethnic lawmakers on both statewide and local levels. For example, one of the most outright powerful non-white statewide lawmakers resided in Perry County. Alexander Haywood Curtis is his name, and he deserves and will have a book of his own, frankly. Haywood, at one point being an enslaved person of the Haywood family from North Carolina, the family who founded with others Raleigh, North Carolina, and the family that later, Alexander H. Curtis, the only individual to preside pro tempore of the Alabama Senate during the 19th century. Alexander H. Curtis, likewise, the individual who persons white, bi-ethnic, Black throughout the American South agreed was one of the most influential Black Baptists in the region during the Reconstruction period. Only individual who used his own resources to buy himself out of slavery, which he did in 1859, and later to serve as a state lawmaker. Alexander H. Curtis, also one of the so-called Marian Nine, that is those 9 developers of the Lincoln School, who, along with the Congregationalist minister and AMA agent from the North, who would develop the Lincoln School from the Lincoln School to the Lincoln Normal School, and ultimately in 1873, 1874, to the Alabama State Lincoln Normal School and University. Again, the first institution of its type in not only the South, but this time the entire country. Yet another, I'll again provide only 2 names, though James M. Curtis and some of his descendants are equally important to this affluence that was shown by Black and bi-ethnic persons in Marion and in the rest of Perry County. But another name, Thomas Lee, who was one of the individuals who served as a delegate to the 1867 Constitutional Convention of Alabama. It was believed by many persons that he was one of the most respected individuals at that particular convention. And he, I guess, expressing the sort of pragmatic approach that the Black and bi-ethnic delegation took, said that regardless of the type of powerful positions that former Confederates occupied in the former Confederacy, regardless of how individuals might have aided the Confederacy, regardless of those individuals being former slaveholders or former slave masters and so forth, he did not seek any ill will against those individuals who were willing to take an ironclad loyalty oath to the country, that is the United States of America. Once more, that position by Thomas Lee showed that he was, if not necessarily willing to completely let bygones be bygones, but he realized, I guess, in a shrewd manner, that the only way that the county and the state, indeed the region and the country, were going to move forward was that persons of various skin colors worked together. Something that I quite frankly think certain individuals today should consider. Yet another link to Perry County's past and Perry County's present. So the final 2 chapters deal with Perry County during the so-called Jim and Jane Crow era of the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And again, Perry County was, unlike many other places of Alabama, again, not completely unique, not completely devoid of racism and verbal harassment and physical violence and so forth. It simply was not as common in Perry County as it was in several neighboring places. 1875, as soon as the redemption period or the so-called Bourbon period or the renewal, this is some common, well, not so rather common language that's relatively new for that period in Alabama, that last redemption and permanent redemption from 1874 forward moving forward, you have yet again Alexander H. Curtis sort of coming to the fore of politics in the state. Virtually every individual knew that when those conservative Democrats regained control of statewide governance, that they were going to reconstitute the state. 1865 was required. 1867, individuals did not like many of the terms of that state, of that particular constitution that would be ratified in 1868 in, quite honestly, a curious manner. Public education for everyone, for example, to be paid for by taxpayers. Some of the protections that were written into the 1868 Constitution for women, for example, particularly with regard to homesteads, or whether a married person could sell it without the spouse giving consent, essentially, to it, and a number of other items that were included. The universal protection of voting privileges for every male Alabamian. Those things, the sort of new Confederates of 1875 wanted to change. Many of them they could not because of the Civil Rights Act that had been passed and other federal legislation, but they wanted as best as they could to do that. Alexander H. Curtis was one of 3 non-white persons who attended that convention. Several things that he perhaps would have liked to do, he could not do to really give some teeth to the federal piece of legislation regarding civil rights. He could not, for example, overturn the decision by those constitutional drafters to sort of write into law segregated or Jim and Jane Crow public educational facilities. The 1868 Constitution allowed for integrated or at least desegregated facilities as long as adults allowed for that, okayed it. Well, the 1875 Constitution did away with that. Alexander H. Curtis would pass away in 1878, but individuals would sort of take up the mantle, carry on what he and what James M. Childs and so many other individuals, John Dozier and William H. McAlpine, persons who were real sort of giants in Baptist and also in political life in Alabama and the South had done before. As an example, in the 1890s, Alabama led the country in lynching, but there was not a single recorded verified lynching that took place in Perry County. Much of this would continue, much of this sort of quasi-civility would continue into the early 20th century, but things, of course, would change by the middle to late 20th century, the middle to late 1900s. And I think the most well-known activity that blurred and scarred for what Perry County had in large part stood, I maintain, before that period took place on February 18, 1965, at a peaceful demonstration to protest injustice and also to sing spirituals outside of the Marion jailhouse for an individual who had been detained unjustly for essentially agitating the youth. He was said, though that idea was false. A young 26-year-old Baptist deacon by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson sought to protect his grandfather and his mother and his sister and other individuals from harm that was being done to them by not only white citizens of Marion and other parts of Perry County and the Black Belt, but also those individuals who were responsible for protecting them. And in part, not only local law enforcement officials, but also state troopers. And one knows the story, right? James B. Fowler would pump bullets into the abdomen of Jimmy Lee Jackson. In and out one went. Jimmy Lee Jackson would ultimately be moved to the Marion Hospital. Marion had a hospital then. And from there to Good Samaritan in Selma, where he would die on February 26, 1965. A friend of the family of Jimmy Lee Jackson and his grandfather, K.J. Lee, and others was Coretta Scott King. She, along with her husband, Martin, and those then began to actually carry out a pilgrimage, they called it, from the Marion or Selma to Montgomery to confront the arch segregationist George C. Wallace Jr. at Montgomery that James Bevel had sort of thought about, planned, etc., for at least a year. In addition to the Kings, yet another individual who would help to spur some of the civil rights and the human rights activity in Marion of that particular period was Gene Childs, who would ultimately wed, of course, Andrew Young Jr. And so that last chapter, that chapter 8 of the book, as I come to a close here, I'm trying to be mindful of time, sort of takes up that story, including not only those more well-known figures such as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Andrew Young Jr., but also those lesser-known individuals, particularly women, and shows how their activities ultimately would lead to the development, the ratification and adoption of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which of course has been in the news so much lately, in part because of the Shelby decision of 2013 and other attempts post-Shelby to essentially reverse the hands of time with regard to suffrage for all law-abiding individuals, but a number of other very important not only activities, but also individuals with Perry County roots. The Childs and the Curtis family, for example, are ancestors of an individual who will go on to be one of the most powerful federal lawmakers in the United States of America and its territories, William Henry Hasty Jr., who was actually William Henry Hasty III. So again, in wrapping up, those are some of the activities that and individuals that and who are discussed in that closing chapter 8 of the book. By no means, again, do I in this particular work attempt to try to erase the color line, because it to this day, as I stated at the outset, is responsible. That perennially thick, I think, color line is responsible for many of the issues and outright problems in Perry County, both past and present. The book will not provide remedies. That order is an extremely large one. But the book might, it is my hope anyway, serve as a reminder that in one place at one time, Perry County, Alabama, individuals of different skin colors did attempt to smear, if not erase, that color line. That a larger group of citizens will take up their mantle and carry it forward is my hope. Again, Mark and Mabon and others at the Drawn Center, I once more thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to fielding any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Bertis. And we do have some questions here, but man, we really congratulate you on this publication, which is not only a contribution to Alabama history, an important contribution, but also to the history of the South, as you pointed out, to American history. But we do have some questions here. Your colleague and friend from the other side of the country, Mike Fitzgerald, who is also a scholar of Reconstruction and has a recent book, Reconstruction in Alabama, congratulates you on this publication, as you will see on Facebook comments. But he also has a question and would love for you to talk about how typical you think Perry County's situation is of neighboring areas. And we'd have some additional questions, but if you'd give us a good response to that, we would appreciate it.
Sure. Mike, hello. And I think likewise. And in fact, Mike might call me later on or text me later on, and deservedly so, and castigate me essentially for not mentioning him among those persons whom I thank, because Mike has been a champion of this work. In fact, really since the dissertation, a story that he thought should be told. And he and I have had several debates about certain things, particularly with regard to the level of violence that took place, not only or the lack thereof in Perry County, but in the Black Belt as a whole, and whether that commenced in earnest following the adoption of the 1868 Constitution and the 1870 gubernatorial race, and when the sort of economy of the Black Belt was fine. Was that times when violence was at a minimum, and then it only ramped up when the financial and economic situation sort of went badly. But anyway, to answer Mike's question, I myself have not found that the overall situation in Perry County, both before the American Civil War and following the American Civil War, was a typical occurrence. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that Perry County was entirely unique, nor am I saying that Perry County was a utopia, because it was not. But the level of cooperation that I have located through my research and others' research as well does not point Perry County to be a typical locality. And here's the good thing about this type of work, Mark and Mike and others, is that if my hypothesis, my theory, if they're wrong, then where are the studies that make clear the typicality of Perry County? Again, that level of biracial cooperation, bi-ethnic cooperation, to be able to put together an institution. Again, it was the only institution, it meaning the Lincoln Normal School and then the Alabama State Lincoln Normal School and University, of its type in the entire South. So why did not that institution come about in, say, Selma and Dallas County? And of course, I have my own reasons for that, including Selma being hurt much worse than was Perry, Selma being hurt much worse than was Marion during the American Civil War. And that having, sort of a shadow, a twilight of disgust among the predominant white leadership of Dallas County at the time. But if once more, if Perry County was not as atypical as I suggest, then it is my hope then that this book and Mike's book and others will lead scholars to write more about those things and those areas and those people rather in the American South during Reconstruction, who did get along to a significant degree. A question was asked earlier regarding, actually it was Mark and I talking about this before we came online here. Well, what's the common belief about Reconstruction? And oftentimes, unfortunately, it's still communicated as being either a dreadful period, one of much, much violence, insurmountable violence, or one of much political sort of wrongdoing, insurmountable political wrongdoing. When the truth of the matter is, I think it more accurate to suggest that it was no more political injustice simply because you had non-white persons who were introduced into the body politic than any other period. And now I hate to, and I really do hate to say this, but I think it legitimate. One looks at what's happening right now, and I propose that there is sort of a third redemption that has taken place since the election of Barack Obama as the United States president. And we're seeing I'm seeing some of the same type of rhetoric that was used during the first Reconstruction, from states rights versus federal rights, strict economy, low taxes, all of these things that a certain Atwater in the 1980s said persons used to sort of mask the real reasons for these divisions, which is skin color, which is racism. We're finding ourselves having to deal with now. But that's a long way of coming back to Mike's question about how typical was Perry County for other places. And again, I do not see that Perry County was as typical as some other places, particularly with regard to recorded and verified physical violence.
Very good. Thanks for that. I want to bring this one on to the screen from Scotty Kirkland, congratulating you on the publication. You are giving hope to someone who has labored long on a community study. And so Scotty asked, why do you think tracing the long arc of places like Perry County are important to expanding our knowledge of Alabama history? Why do you think some of these local stories were either ignored or marginalized for so long?
I think once more, Scotty, and I'm just getting myself in all sorts of trouble here because I did not thank the staff and then others at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And Steve and I have a meeting this evening. So, boy, I'm just all in trouble. So, Scotty, thank you. And thank you, of course, for your authored book regarding constitutionalism in Alabama that appeared earlier. I forget the specific date. But it rounds out, I think, Scotty, a picture of Alabama not being this deplorable place. And I know Alabamians, I mean, let's just be honest. We do things every day to give people reason to make such negative statements about us. I shall not say anything. I won't go further into that. I'll leave that for someone else to do. But the picture that is my hope paint of Perry County suggests that there was a time, again, and place, and perhaps this time and place can resurface where individuals put aside, at least, if even just for utilitarian reasons, almost quid pro quo, put aside some of those barriers, right, race and ethnicity and so forth, and came together to work for mutual uplift, shows that it can be done even in a period that was so divided. We're talking about Reconstruction. We're coming off not only the American Civil War, but also the legal freeing of 430 plus individuals whose masters and owners had known nothing but them being enslaved for the most part, but also those individuals themselves. So you're talking about a revolutionary period. So if those individuals could get along doing that relatively small block of time, then certainly it is my hope that individuals moving forward, daughters and sons and others, will find a way to replicate their acts. Why that story has been ignored or overlooked, those local stories that provide that alternate positioning sort of that sweeping narrative about the American South either being all bad or all, some folks say all great. There are stories that are written to try to make it seem like Reconstruction really did more than it did for the permanent changing of society. That's a very good question. In part, maybe because of some of the laborious work that it takes to unearth some of these documents. You have to go spend time in the archive. You have to try to track down these individuals who might have written records or oral histories of what took place, particularly, Scotty, and others, when one is talking about persons of African descent. Right? They oftentimes did not have the type of means to really leave behind those written and other reliable records and documents that one could use to prove that assertions are valid, to prove that assertions are correct. So I myself think, anyway, that the field for corrective sort of, and if one wants to call it revisionist, if it's revisionist and correct, so be it. This corrective sort of history is wide open for young students. And I am confident that the type of story that I tell in Civil War, Civil Beings, and Civil Rights, there are stories like that for every county that is in Alabama. Now, I'm not asking folks to go out and write the thing just yet. Now, let my book get old before you do that. But it is my hope, again, that that's the type of work, that's the type of study, that's the type of contribution that others will do in the future.
Well, I think you're certainly pointing out why this period of Reconstruction is so important today to understand. to help inform what's going on. And related to that, Clara Lewis Evans, University of Alabama Press, has a question. What is the best terminology besides redemption to refer to the post-Reconstruction period in the late 1800s? You mentioned that there's some discussion taking place about that in scholarly circles. We'll have you respond to that, and then we'll end our program.
Okay, well, there are several. There's the old term, redemption is the term that's, I think, used most common. And there are a number of scholars who've actually surveyed the literature to decide which term is most appropriate, from C. Van Woodward to Alan Johnson, an individual who wrote about Alabama during the Bourbon period. He called Glenn Feldman and Sam Webb. There are a number of individuals who discussed this. The most recent is the renewal, but that's, it just hasn't become en vogue yet. So in terms of a best statement, a best rather term, it really simply depends on your choice. All right, because if one reads primary records, redemption is used. One reads primary sources, restoration is also used. The restoration of democratic rule. Bourbon at one point was sort of commonplace in the literature, but there were many, in terms of primary source documents, there were many individuals who did not use the terminology because the term itself came from the Bourbon leader, Charles X, who said essentially that the French Revolution would be immaterial. A French society would be the same following the revolution as it was before. So, what one wants to use for that period, in addition to those terms, you still have the sort of mainstay of Jim Crow, which Pauli Murray and others sort of amended or emended, actually, by including not simply Jim Crow, as sort of political and educational backwardness that certain white lawmakers and other powerful individuals, along with ordinary citizens, wish to enforce, but also the type of gender and sexual discrimination that persons of African ancestry who were not men also faced. Logan used the term, the nadir of the African American experience or experiences, and by that, of course, he meant since the emancipation of those millions of formerly enslaved individuals by the 13th Amendment in 1865. So again, there are a number, I think, of legitimate terms that one can use. Probably the least used now of that being Bourbon, and for reasons that I've expressed, but also others. And then renewal is one, again, that is I found it used in one source, and I make mention of that, so that this democratic control was renewed in places throughout the American South in the late 1860s and the 1870s. But one, I don't think, can go wrong, so to speak, with redemption or with restoration.
Thanks for that. And as a way of closing, I'd love for us, as we end, Mabin will take us out so that people can view this cover photo that is used on the cover of your book. But tell us about this photograph, since this book is bringing the stories of local people to publication. Who are some of the folks that we are seeing, and what is this photograph?
The photograph itself, Mark, you would get me in trouble yet again, but that's okay. That's all right. So the photograph it comes from a scrapbook, essentially, that's housed in the archives of Auburn University. Former archivist Elizabeth Wales, in fact, years ago when I was there, sort of nudged me towards it while I was there doing some research. So, well, there's a scrapbook, and she, of course, is a Johnson alumna, and was saying there's a scrapbook with some images of the Lincoln School and also the Black and the bi-ethnic citizenry of that place. I think you should look at. So I did, and as I began to flip through the scrapbook, there were all these wonderful black and white images, and I stumbled across this particular photograph that was taken seemingly by an individual whose name is Alan Christopher Oxford. I was later told by Francis Osborne Robb, and Later, he would become the first resident photographer, she tells me, in Birmingham. But at the time that he perhaps took this image of the Lincoln Normal School, he might have been in business in Maryland with an individual by the name of Oliver Hubbard. So in terms of identifying the individuals who are on it, no one as yet that I'm aware of has been able to do so. Oxford did not list any names and perhaps didn't know the individuals. The flip side of the actual photograph reads that it was roughly 1872. But there is some discussion about this photograph actually being taken at the dedication ceremony of the institution that predated. It was a new building that was built essentially in 1868 and 1869. The building was dedicated on April 11, 1869. There are some individuals who perhaps think that this image is one of the photographs that was taken to commemorate that particular action. I go with 1872 again, because that is what's written in pencil on the backside of the photograph. But if I had to take a guess, there was probably Stephen Childs, who was a son of James M. Childs, who passed away in 1871. Alexander H. Curtis doubtless would have been there. John Dozier, who would have been educating there. And also individuals are perhaps aware of William Reuben Pettiford, who would go on to not only lead 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, but also to help found the Alabama Penny Savings Bank, the first bank in the state that was owned wholly by a person of African descent. He likely would have been there at the time because he would have been a student, among other individuals. And of course, the large Jess group you see are those children there who are in their Sunday's finest. So whatever the reason and whatever the year of that particular photograph, it was something that was special, and something that also sort of fulfilled this prophecy by an individual who said that in essentially bringing about the great promise that God planned for persons of African descent, education would lead the way.
Thank you. We'll remove ourselves in just a second and allow that photograph to remain on the screen so that folks can see it before our broadcast ends, but not before we say thank you. And with your appreciation to you for this presentation, for telling us these stories that are so important, and this scholarship that is making a contribution. And congratulations on the publication of this book.
It's my honor. Thank you.